Morning, everybody. It's great to be back here. I love this conference, and it's been a couple of years since I've been able to be here now, so it's just really awesome to be back on this stage. I know we're starting late, so I'm going to try to go as quickly as I can. My goal here is to lay a little bit of a foundation, because this conference is supposed to be themed on content operations this year, and since that's one of the things that I talk about pretty frequently, I thought maybe I could come and I could give you a little bit of how I see content operations as a basis for more conversation throughout the next couple of days. So to do that, I'm going to cover three things today. I'm going to tell you what I believe content operations is. I'm going to tell you why I believe you need content operations. And then I'm just going to leave you with a few concepts that I think might be useful as we're looking at other presentations or having conversations throughout the next couple days. All right, so let's start off and say, what is content ops? So I believe content ops is really a couple of different things. The one that I think we all start with is the technology. We think of content operations as being a technical infrastructure. It's the stuff that we use to produce and then publish content, manage it along the way, all of those types of things. So I think there's a very hard physical aspect to this, even though it's usually software, where we're thinking of content operations as being this technical ecosystem or technical set of tools that come together into what it is that we see as this larger system. And it is that. So it certainly is the infrastructure that we use as technical professionals to create, manage, collaborate on, review, publish content out for content experiences. But it's also people and process. So as we think about really going from more ad hoc, sometimes desktop-based systems to collaborative content operations-based infrastructures, we can't forget that half of it is us. Half of it is the people in this room coming together, collaborating, and creating the end result. None of the technologies that anybody sells or builds or works on mean anything, even AI, I will talk about that a little bit later, without the people and the practitioners that are here today. So we are the people who make this into a true content operations ecosystem. We live in the ecosystem, we manage it, we're the ones that take care of it, and we're the ones that extract value out of it. So when we remember that it's the technology, it's the people, and it's the process that come together to create value with content operations, I think that that's a really key thing to keep in mind as we're having all these different presentations and conversations over the next couple of days. So, a little longer version. I think content operations is the ecosystem, and it's the skilled teams that use that ecosystem and that infrastructure to deliver omni-experience content at scale. And there's a couple pieces of this that I want to point out because I think they're important. So one of them is the omni-experience part. So I think that we're moving past a place where we just think of the content coming through channels, because a website's a channel, right? Well, yes, but modern websites that are driven by content operations can have a lot of different experiences. What I experience on a website might not be what you experience. And I think that's a really key driver in setting up these systems, processes, people, all those types of things. So moving to a place where we recognize that channels are conduits, but realistically it's the experiences that can have a multitude of different implementations at the channels is really, really key. And the other thing is this whole idea of at scale. So in the broadest sense, writing a Word document and emailing it to someone is a content operation. But realistically, when we're talking about setting up a content operations ecosystem, we're doing it because we need scale. If you've got a dozen documents or 100 documents or a few pages here or there, you don't need content operations. You don't need a formalized set of infrastructure, people, and processes to manage that in a really reliable and trusted way. So when we start to think about this, we think about points of scale as the points where we need to introduce more infrastructure, upgrade infrastructure, introduce new people who have different sets of skills who can come in and collaborate with us, and new processes which are going to keep us all together and working with these things and making them great and getting the most value out of them.
The thing I love about Heretto is it solves the problems that I had, and sometimes the problems I didn't even know that I had. It's an entire package, it's an entire solution. I have a CCMS that stores my content, and I have a portal that knows how to publish that content. And it's been a great relationship. We have become partners, and I'm looking forward to what we're going to do next.
So I think that those are two really key things to think about as we're going into this. This is what I think content operations is. All right, so why do we need this, other than the things I've already said? So you need content operations because you need to scale content production. This is at the heart of every single content operations implementation. If you don't need to scale your production, or you don't want to, then you probably don't need to go down this path. And I think that that's a really important point, because this stuff is hard. Anybody who tells you that putting together a scalable content operations ecosystem is not hard, they're probably selling you something. It is hard work. It's challenging stuff. And we only do this because we have to. We need to scale our content operations because we're in situations where the demand for our content is growing exponentially. And this doesn't necessarily mean that the content is growing exponentially. So I want to draw a distinction here. I think we've all heard, throughout the years, all the human race created more content in the last 4 days than they did in the last 400 years, these kinds of things. And while that may be true, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about an explosion of blogs or people writing things because they can to try to gather attention. I'm talking about needing to produce different experiences. And some of this is to keep up competitively, but a lot of it is to just meet the expectations of the people that we serve, be they internal to our organizations or external. When we go and we have experiences with content now, most of us think that this content should know us at least a little bit. And this is growing. I don't want to be seeing, if I need to access something, some information, a bunch of stuff that isn't relevant to me where I am and what I'm doing. Because that is time that I have to spend parsing and digesting things that don't get me what I want. And this is only going to continue. So while I think we do need more content, I think we also need our content to do more things. So when we think about the demand for our content growing, we should be thinking about the number of experiences that it produces, not the actual pages or words that we're writing. They're obviously a component, but they're not the whole story. So if we think about this with a little bit of a visual, this is just one way we can think about it. So it's pretty common that organizations that have started down this path, they'll have a product that'll come in a bunch of different variations. And that could be a washing machine that comes in 20 different varieties, or it could be a software system that has modules and it has configurations. And when I buy that software system, it's a little different than one that you buy. So it's an as delivered or an as purchased or an as configured type of a system. And especially in enterprise, this is very, very, very common. So product variants, modules, configurations, that changes the experience of what it is that you're working with. You could have different markets, and these markets could be a combination of different languages, different interpretations, actually different aspects of the system can be sold in different places. And then you have to think about all the different channels, the use cases, the buyer's journeys, stages, all these other things that play into the different experiences that we have with this content. And this creates an explosion because you go from having things that are fairly generic to things which can be very specific. And when it's specific, it's a better experience. And each of these blocks might be the same piece of content, but as you go through these different attributes, you end up with so many different ways to see that one same piece of content. It's really not possible to manage this in any other system than one that is built on top of a content operations paradigm, because you just can't copy and paste this much, is what it really comes down to. You have to be able to manage this in a central location. Although I have seen people try, for what it's worth. All right, so here's an example of this. This is an organization that I've actually worked with for quite a long time, and I think that their circumstance and their implementation is so interesting. So they had a situation where they had a number of different personas that really needed to see different pieces of content. They had a number of places that they needed to publish this content, some static, some web, and then they had geographies. And in this case, it was the states of the United States, plus DC, which for those of you who aren't from the US, that's a little thing that we won't call a state, but it's its own district. When you add all these things, actually multiply all these things together, you end up with a possible variation of every piece of content that's over 6,000 different possibilities. Now, that doesn't mean every piece of content comes in 6,000 different variations, but it means that when somebody accesses it, they're accessing one of 6,000 different possible variations. And that's astounding when you think about it, that there are dozens of variations for every person in this room that they have to maintain. And the thing is that they always had this situation, but before the thought leader and the visionary at this organization came to realize that there was a better way to do this, they just lived with it being broken. So while this seems really out there or really exceptional or not the norm, I think you would find that their situation before realizing that they could accomplish this is a lot more common than you'd expect. What they were doing is they were building a small set of content that served only the most basic needs of their customer and their internal audience. And then they were having people customize it as they were having interactions. So they would take this and they would change a presentation, and they would do that to deliver training, or they would download a PDF as a Word document, and they would change it for a customer when they signed a new customer. And it wasn't that they didn't have these variations, because all of these people in all these situations still existed. It was that they didn't serve them as well, and they diffused the problem out into hundreds of different people that all managed things in varying places. But if you had talked to them before they had gone down this journey, that was just normal. That wasn't a problem. That wasn't a thing that was causing any issues. Now, in the rearview mirror, they can see how enormously impactful this has been, and they've got tons of KPIs that show the change this has had for their customers. So I think the message here is that we've gotten to a place where we accept the state of things in a lot of our content production, and I think it's time to question those. Have we just built layer upon layer of process, workflows, tools built up from things that we had in the past, and it's not really serving our customer, internal or external? Or have we really stepped back and said, are we doing this the right way? Is this the optimum experience? Are we really interacting with people in the way that we should be? And this has never been more critical than it is now, because as we move through where we were before the pandemic and now into where we are going with AI, content is the primary method of interaction in a digital-first world. This is a huge shift. I think a lot of us probably don't think about it every day, but it is massive. It used to be that organizations were set up to have conversations, people to people. This was how we talked to people internally and externally. You shared knowledge by talking to people. But that's not how things are today, and it's not how things are going to be in the future. In the future, we're going to go from having conversations to managing the content of conversations. And this is a massive shift for organizations, because if you think about how we've built our companies and our organizations, we built them so that we train people to say the right things. We train people to know how to answer questions. We train people to know who to answer the question when we don't know the answer to the question. Like, this is the fundamental way that things have been built up from the days of blacksmiths and villages all the way up to Fortune 500 companies that have existed until today. It's always been primarily a method of sharing content and knowledge person to person. But as we get to a place where most of our interactions, be they commercial or support, self-service, or whatever they are being done using asynchronous systems, now we're living in a world where content is the conversation. And systems, be they AI, autonomous, websites, apps, whatever, they are the ones that are actually speaking with and communicating between us. This is how we come to know things, to learn things, to be aware of things. So the people in this room are at the very epicenter of this massive change that has been happening in the world. We are the ones that go out and implement the systems, the processes, build the teams that manage the content of the communication and the conversations that our organizations are having. And the groups that really are as proactive about this as they can be, the ones that go and realize that this is how the world is now going to work, are the ones that are going to see huge gains and are going to be the ones that everybody wants to work for and with because they're efficient and they feel natural, because this is what's natural now. When we want to know something, we don't ask somebody, we don't call somebody, we look it up on our phones. So that's why I think you need content operations, is because I think it is the fundamental basis for the way that communication is changing as we move forward. So now, I just have a couple of concepts that I think are useful. Take them or leave them, but I think that they might be helpful as we're having a conference on content operations. And see if you can guess which of the images in my presentation are AI generated. I was really impressed they could actually make a plane that was coming out of soap. All right, so I've got 4 concepts that I want to talk about, and I'll try to go quick here. One is goals, process, architecture, and AI. All right, so this feels like it should be just a general, like, duh. Obviously, you need to have goals when you go and implement something. But I can't tell you how many very large, and I would consider to be pretty sophisticated organizations go into content operations implementations without really well-defined goals. So I encourage everybody who's starting or in the middle of or rethinking their content operations to go and think about your goals. Put numbers against them. And if you don't have numbers, make up some numbers that you can measure. Having some measurement is better than no measurement. Try to know where the goal line is. What does victory look like? And I think a relatively easy way to do that and get everybody on the same page is this little battle card. So I like this. It doesn't have to be comprehensive. It's something you can steal and use if you want. If you want, I can actually just send it to you after the fact, so you don't have to take pictures of it. But if you want to, you can. So think about where your content's going. Those are your channels. Think about your content. Think about who's involved, who you're serving, who you're collaborating with. What are your key business objectives? What are your major probably challenges? What are the things we think we're going to run into? So if we run into some other things, we're like, oh, well, we didn't think about that. At least we knew it was something that we hadn't thought about, hadn't discussed. And then finally, get some KPIs. I don't think you need to spend a ton of time on this, but if you can share this in a way where it has everybody just kind of generally on the same page, like we can all kind of agree that this is like a 10,000 foot blueprint for what we're trying to accomplish here in the next stage, I think it can be really, really beneficial. So another thing in terms of how we think about this, I like this concept of soup versus lasagna as it results in delivered content for 2 reasons. One is that I came up with it and it makes me feel clever. And 2, because I think it's a pretty good articulation of the ways that we consume content. So every content experience we have, it really is somewhere between dynamically assembled as we're consuming it and fully assembled by the creator. And one is not better than the other. I think that's really critical. So learning courses, we build them in a very specific way because we want people to learn something in a very specific order. This is also true to some extent with things like user guides. It's definitely true with processes. You wouldn't want a process that was randomly assembled. Other things are going to be generated and put in front of us as we move through more organic workflows. So as you're thinking about how you're going to put together your content operations ecosystem process and all those types of things, you should think about the ways in which people are going to consume them and how it is that's going to be placed in front of them. I don't think that there's necessarily going to be an ecosystem that is designed to serve one or the other of these, but they can lean in one direction or another. And I think that this is one of the critical things that really should be thought of before entering into especially technology selection. Because if you buy technology that's really good at soup and you need lasagna, that's technology you're going to throw away and you're going to go get a new piece of technology. And that's an investment that you shouldn't waste. The last little thing that I think is really interesting to think about here before we move on to process is this idea of per unit cost. It's not something we talk about a lot in content, but as we're going and we're seeing the explosion of experiences, we should start thinking about the cost of an individual experience. What is our per unit cost for an incremental experience? Because that really dictates what we can do, right? If it's 0, we can create as many experiences as we want. It's not 0. But if you don't know, and somebody comes and asks you to put this here or create this for this audience or add this, geography or this localization or whatever it may be, then you can't say, well, sure, but we need this. So time, money, whatever it may be, know your per unit cost. Know how to drive it down. Think about changing it over time. Because as you're thinking about where you're going to invest in automation, if you know how this is going to affect your per unit cost, what you really know is not how much money it's going to save you, you know how much more you can do with what you have. And that's the critical piece about per unit cost. You'll notice that I put a picture of a chip up here because chips haven't really changed price in real terms in the last, 30-ish years or whatever. But they've gotten a lot faster because the per unit cost of a single switch or piece of logic of the silicon on the chips has gone down so much. So we didn't change the actual cost of the chips substantially, we changed what the chips could do. We added more in when our per unit cost went down. It's the same thing for content if you know the rules there. All right, process. So this is defining your operating model. This room is probably more sophisticated on this than a lot of other places, but I'll go through it real quick anyways. The idea is really sitting down and drawing this out to go from something which can be kind of ad hoc, like we all kind of know how it works, like we know that we get the thing from Jerry and we give it to Jill, but we don't really have it well established. So I think every workflow for content can basically be laid out in these 4 major buckets. Sometimes they'll change, sometimes they could be a little bit combined, but generally speaking, these are the 4 major things that we do when we create content. There's a lot of stuff under each of those. There's a lot of things that we do inside of each of these buckets, but generally speaking, if you want to get content to somebody, you have to create it, you have to review it, you have to prepare it to go to that person, then you have to deliver it to them. So breaking this down can be really powerful because it allows us to start to interrogate the pieces of our process. And if you really want to make incremental change, you want to drive that per unit cost down, you have to know what's inside of your big blocks. You have to know where all the little things are. You have to be able to unpack it. So how do things get from place to place? Who's really responsible for what? Where are the potential bottlenecks? And most key, which pieces can you automate? So when you think about technology, other than the foundational things that just kind of go from 0 to 1, they allow us to do something. You can't have a website without a website system of some form, even if it's just HTML and an FTP server. You're really almost always purchasing things which are taking work away. They are automating. They are creating change. They are adding value by removing work that we need to do so that we can do more. And if you look at that under a microscope, it allows you to say, oh, wait, why are we doing that? Is that something we need to do? Okay, it is something we need to do. Do we need to do it? Or could we automate it? And if you go through with a fine-tooth comb, I think you'd be surprised by how many things you can find in there. All right, I'm going to run through a very high-level architecture because I think it can be useful, and then I'll talk a little bit about AI and I'll get off the stage. All right, so 2 things I want to say about architecture before I jump into it. One is that when you really get to a high level of maturity, there's no such thing as a single system. It doesn't matter how complex, how advanced, how great your whatever technology you're using is, it's going to be a part of an ecosystem. Every single content operations implementation becomes an ecosystem of multiple tools, typically multiple teams, a lot of processes over time. And this is why interoperability is so key. Interoperability is the basis of being able to connect things in an efficient way. There's a number of different layers to interoperability. On the content side, you should choose something that's easy to move between systems or easy to understand how it can transition between systems. So there are standards that can be beneficial here, but you can also build your own internal standards as long as they are very well fixed, they're very well defined, and they are things that are easy to transition in and out of the systems that are important to you. There are also more centralized and decentralized approaches when you look at content operations ecosystems. Sometimes you'll really focus on having one central single source of truth from a repository perspective, and this has implications. And other times you'll look at how you bring together a lot of different repositories in a way that doesn't create duplication, maintains truth, maintains trust, all those types of things. Again, one's not necessarily better than the other, but it is helpful to know which paradigm that you're in. So every single architecture, this is the tools, for content operations, in my view, can really be broken down into three major pieces. You have where your content comes from, you have the set of intermediary middle layers that allows your content to go out to other things, even if they are extremely simplistic. Sometimes you are the content services. You take the zip file and you upload it to the server, and there you go, you're the content service. And then you have your apps. This is where people actually consume it. So if you expand this a little bit, I think that this broadly looks like this. And I'm going to go from right to left, right? Yeah. So apps back over to the content source because I'm going to spend a little more time on the content source. So apps can be anything. They can be any place that we consume this. So a website is an app. A support system is an app. A doc site is an app. The future AI systems that I probably should have put a bubble up on here for is an app. These are best served when they have content services that they connect to. Now again, like I said, sometimes you are the service, you take the files, you upload them into the app physically, but in that case, you're just acting as the conduit. More often today, these are APIs. These are things that are driven by technology that will move content or make content available, and they can be sophisticated. So they can do things like access control and search and transformation and personalization. Like content services can really get to a place where they're adding a lot of value. They're not just moving content. So now looking at the content source, these things can be very complex. They can be very simple. Technically, a file system is a content source. It's probably not the type of content source you want to build a content operation system to scale on top of, but it can be. And there's a couple of major pieces for this. So you need a content operations platform, and that's really where your content is. It's kind of where you work in your content, those types of things. You may or may not need localization and translation services. That depends if you localize or translate. And then a lot of organizations will have microservices or other systems that connect to these types of things. So the most basic implementation is really just going to be, this box here. There's a laser on this, right? Yeah. And then you can add some things around it that can be beneficial. Going through this very quickly, the manage piece is the fundamental heart and center of the content operations platform. This will have all of your storage, your history, your linking, tracking, analytics, reporting. Depending on what it is that you really need, that's management in terms of your content operations platform. Creation is where you collaborate. It's how you actually put the content together. It's obviously connected to the management system. And then connect, this is where your APIs are. This is how you get things from place to place. This is how you bring things into the automation systems that can drive these other things which are connected down here below. And then finally, our automation layers are the things that allow us to gain the efficiencies over time. So when you think about having a really strong platform to build your content operation system on top of, you should be thinking about how it allows you to automate processes over time. This is critical because it's where you're going to drive down that per unit cost. It's where you're going to make your gains. It's what's going to enable you. So is this the only one? No, it's not. There's not one architecture to rule them all. So here's an expanded version of that. And I actually think this is much more common when you get to like enterprise, where you have identity management. Identity management is really key when you're looking at personalization, which is one of the reasons we do this, because if you don't know who somebody is, you can't personalize the content to them. So think about identity management. That's a really key component to this that a lot of people think is a different system, but it's part of your content operations system, even if you're not managing it. Enterprise ontology and metadata management, that can be really important. If you're in this kind of paradigm, this is more of a centralized paradigm, sometimes it's less important, sometimes it's integrated into your content ops platform, but typically there is something which is going to stretch over more things in the business, and integrating with it can be really powerful. Here's another example of how this can come together. So this is a multi-repository, this is more of a distributed system. And now what you see is that enterprise ontology management system has become the conduit to different content services. And yes, you can have different content services. You can be in a place where you have an API that's really good at this, and you have a service over here which is really good at this. There's no reason that you have to build a monolith in terms of a service. You can have your services meet the needs of whichever apps you're interacting with. And so maybe 4 of your apps use this service and 3 of your apps use this other service. But they all come through a centralized system that allows them to access and recombine the content in the way that works for your business. So I think this is a really viable architecture too. Okay, talk about AI for a second, and then I'll let you guys get your coffee. Heard this one before? We don't need to do X. AI will figure it out in a couple of years. So I don't know about you guys, but I've never actually seen this work. And this isn't new. This has been happening for decades now. We've been told we were going to have self-driving cars and all other kinds of manners of magical things that AI was going to figure out for us. AI has definitely replaced some work, very much in the same way that excavators replaced a lot of people with shovels. Still a lot of construction workers. I don't think that they think excavators are taking their jobs. It's a tool, right? But this is a mentality that's really easy to slide into. It's especially an easy mentality to slide into when you don't really understand what goes into the types of production that we do and the types of work that we do and the complexity of what it is that we do. So it's common that people who are a little bit further away from our work will think, oh, AI's going to take care of it. It's not. It will help us, but it's not going to take care of it. Microsoft knows this. They know that AI is only as good as your data. This is one of their release events just a couple of days ago. Google knows it. There was a leaked document from Google 4 or 5 weeks ago that said that more data is not better than better data, which is wild when you think about an engineer at Google saying that smaller models for AI can outperform larger models if the data is better. So if there's one thing that I would take away from all the things that I've been reading recently on AI, other than it's powerful, it's exciting, and it is really, really scary, it's that if you want to leverage it, you've got to build the right infrastructure. You have to have the right structured content and data underneath it to get the most out of it. And so I want to end with a little bit of an analogy here. So this is an old drawing. This is when people thought we would have self-driving cars in the 90s. And apparently they would look like that. So I don't know how many of you remember that in the 90s, they were actually working on autonomous vehicles, but they were taking a very different approach. Back then, what they thought we were going to do is that we were going to go and we were going to build a new set of infrastructure that had smart roads and sensors and all those types of things around the vehicle, and then put enough intelligence in the vehicle to work with those things. We were going to change our infrastructure to change the way that we moved, which actually makes a lot of sense because that's what we've done every time we've wanted to change the way that we've moved in the past. When we wanted to run trains across countries, we put in rails. We wanted to fly planes between places, we put in airports. When we wanted trains to not need drivers anymore, like they do at a lot of airports, we had to change the way that worked too. We put in doors to make sure people didn't step onto the tracks. We added in safety systems. We added in sensors around those tracks to make sure that those autonomous trains didn't have to do a ton of thinking to be autonomous because they're not people. So one of the things that I think is most interesting about this image here is these things. Look at this. So at first I didn't see these at first because they kind of look like the dotted lines in the road. What are those? I think that those are the recognition that they had to put sensors for the cars to follow, so the cars knew where they were. We gave up on this idea because in the early 2000s, people said, oh, don't worry about that. AI will figure it out. I don't know about you, but I'm still waiting for my self-driving car. Now, yes, we have gotten to level 2 and 3, and there's glimmers of level 4 self-driving vehicles. But level 5, which is truly autonomous, if you ask the experts on this, they basically say, it's coming. We're not exactly sure when. If you're Google, you de-invest. If you're Uber, you drop your department on it. But like, it is coming. It's coming for sure, and it is coming. But the reality is that we could have been there 10 or 20 years earlier if we had taken just a more holistic approach to this. And this is a direct analogy to content and content operations. If you want to get the most out of your content as it relates to the new experiences and new technologies that AI and the opportunities it's going to present, you can't forget about infrastructure, because it's going to work better on better infrastructure. So the thought I will leave you with is that revolutions require infrastructure. If you want to make a major change, you want to be the first one there, do the work, the hard work of changing your infrastructure to leverage the technologies that are coming down the pike. It'll pay off, I promise. Thanks.
All right. Thank you so much. Guys, do you have any questions? We've got questions.
Are we still doing the round, the Ask Me Anything tomorrow? No? Okay, all right.
I don't know. We'll see.
Hey, Patrick.
Hey.
So, hi, I'm Pavel from
Pavel.
Krakow.
Okay, yeah, hey, how are you?
So you talked about scaling your content, which really speaks to me, and I agree with that. You talked about the revolutions and the changes and everything. You need to keep up with that. Among all that, infrastructure is key, and I also agree. I'm an infrastructure guy.
Mm-hmm.
So now, do you think vendor lock-in is a risk? How big of a risk is it, and how do you deal with that?
That's a great question. So let me reframe that a little bit. I think any technology system bought or implemented has the possibility of lock-in. So I've seen people who are very locked into vendors. I've seen people who are very locked into things they built themselves. Everything has inertia when you put it together, and people get bought into it. You build things around it, and all of those types of things. And they're almost always things that we don't see coming. I think like that's one of the most dangerous parts about lock-in, is that you start with something and it works really well, and then you build something, 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 and that little core may not be sufficient anymore. And then it either falls over or people like hold it up, basically. So I do think that lock-in is something that you have to be really, really careful about. Theoretically, this is why we have standards. In practice, is that how it always works out? Nah, I don't know, maybe. I think that some standards do a better job of this than others. I think some ecosystems do a better job of compliance with those standards than others. And I think that that's probably your best way of mitigating lock-in. Having really clean separations between systems, I think, can help too. So if you take a really API approach to things, and like the transitions between systems, like you're keeping true to like the key bits of semantic and metadata that's required for your implementation. And when you move things, you're not necessarily like building overly complex transitions. They're like super clean, I think can help you pull pieces out more efficiently, which I think can allow you to be less locked into certain paradigms, tools, vendors, whatever they may be. But there's no doubt that no matter what you do, there's going to be some level of inertia in the technology you buy or build.
Okay, we had one more question for sure. There's one here. One more. Okay, we have 4 questions.
Okay, I'll take the next one. Hi, Patrick.
Hey.
I'm Maaret. Some of you have seen me yesterday in the workshop. I have a question. I agree with what you're saying, and we were talking along the same lines in the workshop, but one thing that I was thinking when talking about the infrastructure is the management and leadership of the infrastructure. Mm-hmm. So how do you see, based on your experience, the sort of competence level of managers and leaders? I'm talking about two different things here because I think you manage things and you lead people. So in this kind of a change, because this is a huge change.
That is also a really good question. So I think I've seen a range. I think we probably all worked with, for that kind of thing, a range of people in these environments. So I don't know that I have like a really holistic view of that, honestly, because the people that I see in these implementations are by nature probably going to be a little more advanced than the average population, just because they are actively implementing content operations. And that requires a level of recognition that I think leads to probably a higher quality of management and leadership. But that being said, there's no doubt that when you have really exceptional managers, really exceptional leaders, they're transformative in these processes. And the thing that, the common thread through all of them is that they're the ones that recognize that there's no quick solution. That like, you have to do the pieces in order, you have to do the change management, you have to train people, you have to make sure you bring them along. Like, they recognize that content operations isn't buying some software and then being like, yay. It's a whole big thing. It's a big project, and it involves people. That's, I think, the biggest thing that I've seen is the difference.
Thank you for your great questions, Guy. Like, your brains are really working thanks to that coffee today. Awesome. I'd like to just remind everybody who's watching us in their sofa at home that if you have any questions, you can ask them in Talk Questions. That's a channel on our Slack. All right. And I also would like to remind you guys, tell us your name and stand up. Thank you.
Hi, Patrick. I'm Balint from Sita, Ireland. And my question is that I'm curious about your opinion about this very popular philosophy with startups that content operations has to conform as much as possible to the DevOps process and tooling for the sake of efficiency and cost effectiveness.
Well, so I think that there's no really universal answer for that. There's no doubt that in a startup, there's less content because it's a startup and it's just starting. So I think that there's an aspect of like simpler tooling can be better. And I don't think that that's wrong by any means. I think the reality is that like as you move from a DevOps approach, which is typically like Git of some flavor and Markdown of some flavor, you have to move to, if you decide to move to something which is more of like a CCMS with an XML markup, which has a lot of advantages, but it has more overhead too. Like you have to have people who are practitioners who understand how to operate that. And if you're in a team of 10 in a startup, like how many startups at 10 people have content operations and technical writer? Other than Heretto, because we created technology for that. But like you just don't see that, right? So if you could go build a super sophisticated technical infrastructure, but if there's nobody there to use it, it's not going to do anything. I think recognizing that at a certain point, I think all startups probably wait too long to move past that. And I think it causes them to do some crazy things sometimes, some probably really wasteful things, probably just purely out of ignorance, like they just don't know what they don't know. But I think that when you are truly a startup, you are truly 10, 20 people, I think the likelihood that you have somebody who's able to implement, manage, lead that technology in a way that you're going to get the most out of it, I'm skeptical of that idea 90%, 99% of the time. So I don't know if that's an answer, but that's how I think about that.
Yep, that soap is going delivered. Okay, so we have 2 more questions and we're gonna stop at those 2 questions, okay? Let's start here.
Oh, thank you. Hello, Patrick. I'm Pavel. You mentioned AI as a tool. I completely agree. But do you see any threats to authorship and copyright related to AI? Right now there is a writer's strike, and as probably know, in the show business. And one of the pain points is putting some limitations on the use on AI in the showbiz. But I think it may also apply to other forms of writing.
I would much prefer to debate this over a beer tonight. I mean, I think very, very broadly, yes. I don't know that the current generation of GPT technologies are really the threat that people think they are from that perspective. The reality is that they do some things really, really well, but they don't do everything really, really well. And I think that we've gone through the world's fastest hype curve on this, and we're starting to see some of those challenges. I think the best experts' opinions we're seeing right now are highly skeptical that we're going to be able to eliminate hallucination. And I mean, who here would accept a system that may or may not be right in technical writing? Right. So I think you're okay in that regard. In terms of like writing episodes for Seinfeld, I don't know. I mean, like that's not really my area of expertise. I'm sure that they've done their research and they're striking for the right reasons. As copyright, I don't know. Like I can argue that one both ways, but yeah, I don't know. I don't have a good answer for that. Sorry.
All right, we have one last question up here.
So, hello, Patrick. I'm Gergely. Thank you for the enlightening presentation. I just would like to ask if you can define some scale points where it pays off to migrate to a content ops setup. We are on the way with structured content, but by far not there.
Sorry, I missed the last part of that. What was it about structured content?
But by far not near to content ops.
So scale points. Mm-hmm. So I think one scale point is when you go from having one version of your product to 2 or 3 versions of your product. And I think this happens to every company over time that builds something relatively sophisticated. So I think that's a very common scale point. The super traditional scale point is absolutely when you have to translate your content. Like that was the driver of, kind of what started this industry for 20 years. When I think you get enough content that it's harder to find it with traditional search, and you need to start adding metadata so that people can go and decide, oh, well, I'm not looking for everything, I'm looking for things on this topic, or looking at things that relate to this. When you get to a place where you have one document and you don't want to show certain people this piece and this piece and this piece, and the only way to do that is to copy it these many times, that's a pain point that you have to make sure that you start to scale for those. When your content needs to be going to 2 different systems and saying the same thing. Now, obviously, the way that we've managed this in the past is we've copy and pasted between it, but that clearly doesn't scale. So I think you kind of have to make your own judgments as to when writing in Google Docs or Word and copying and pasting to different locations isn't working anymore. I personally think that it doesn't work at 50 pages, but I think I've seen people do it at 500 or even 1,000 pages. So, I mean, make your own judgment there.
Okay, thank you.
All right, those are all questions. We didn't get any questions from our virtual audience. Thank you, Patrick. That's been amazing.